Hello, I'm Jeremy Holliday, and this is my presentation on A Good Teacher Turns Bad. Stress at home causes problems at school, and this is my case study in my educational evaluation class for EDL 851. To start off, the case study is about a first grade teacher, Mrs. Horton, whom parents in the school district have started to complain about. She is a former Teacher of the Year recipient and is showing less motivation in her job. She didn't come in much over the summer, and also there have been rumors from staff about troubles at home with her husband having left, and now she's raising two teenage boys. Also, Mrs. Wilson, the administrator at Mrs. Horton's school, is the one who's been receiving many of these complaints, and she's noticed a little difference in Mrs. Horton as well. She specifically heard from a parent, Mr. Stafford, who wanted to meet with both Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Horton, and so they decide to hold the meeting. And while at the meeting, Mrs. Horton ends up getting very frustrated with Mr. Stafford, and part of that is because he is asking to move his daughter out of her classroom, and is saying that she does not do a good job of teaching it. So Mrs. Wilson asks Mr. Stafford to leave, and says that she will follow up with him after she's talked more with Mrs. Horton. So first off, to break this case study down, what I know is Mrs. Horton has been very good at her job. She has been, like I said, a recipient of the Teacher of the Year award, and you don't just get that for casually going through the daily grind of teaching, putting forth a little effort. So she's obviously been invested in teaching before. Mrs. Wilson, the administrator, the principal at the elementary school, has been receiving complaints about Mrs. Horton, and then Mr. Stafford is the parent who's asked to have his daughter Julie moved out of Mrs. Horton's class. A few things that I need to know include, why is Mrs. Horton being so defensive about Mr. Stafford calling her out in areas that he perceives as weaknesses, specifically as to why she is always yelling at students and making them feel unsafe. His own daughter Julie is crying before coming to school, so he obviously is very discouraged at the situation. Another thing I need to know is, why did Mrs. Wilson not schedule a meeting to talk with Mrs. Horton prior to Mr. Stafford coming in? One of Mr. Stafford's big complaints was that Mrs. Horton wasn't prepared for the meeting. She was kind of getting some things around, and he had taken off of work to come in and chat, and so he had become frustrated. And Mrs. Wilson, the principal, had said, I need to talk some more with Mrs. Horton to understand the situation more. I was confused why she didn't do that in the first place. And last but not least, what did Mrs. Horton do that made Mr. Stafford so frustrated? Obviously, his daughter's crying before coming to school, and doesn't feel safe at school with the way that Mrs. Horton talks to her students. So ultimately, this problem boils down to Mrs. Horton isn't creating a safe learning environment for students to learn. And that is one of the number one jobs as an educator. Category 2 my proposed plan of action with appropriate strategies for implementation. I'll move my video here in just a moment. But to start off, I think after Mrs. Wilson makes sure Mr. Stafford is gone, she'll want to discuss with Mrs. Horton about why she's so fired up from the meeting with Mr. Stafford. She had yelled at Mr. Stafford, calling him a liar, and yeah, I just was initially shocked by her response to Mr. Stafford. After discussing with Mrs. Horton, she needs to go back and reread through student handbooks and policies regarding topics, and not just the student handbook, but the district handbook too, on policies regarding difficulties with teachers, to make sure that she follows these policies correctly. After she reviews those, Mrs. Wilson then needs to meet with Mr. Stafford separately to hear more in depth from him as to why him and his wife have been frustrated with Mrs. Horton, and that will give her a little more understanding into the situation as well. I think she should also meet with Julie to get an inside scoop from her as to some of the feelings she's having within the classroom. After meeting with both Mrs. Horton, Mr. Stafford, and his wife, and Julie, then Mrs. Wilson needs to determine if the request being made to move Julie into another classroom is legitimate and valid. And if it is, then she needs to go ahead and move that student. And no matter what, I think due to multiple concerns about Mrs. Horton, not just from this Mr. Stafford incident, but from other parents as well, Mrs. Wilson should make sure that she's performing more random walkthroughs and that these are being performed more regularly as well, so she's got a good understanding of what's going on in that class. And last but not least, Mrs. Wilson needs to be sure to have a conference with Mrs. Horton about how to move forward in this school year. Ultimately, she needs to be able to be successful in creating a safe environment. Next up, Category 3, resolve the issues based on promoting the success of all students, assuming that Mr. Stafford's concerns are valid and Julie needs to be moved to a different class. A few things he stated is Julie's crying before coming to school, she's not eating, she's also not sleeping well. So all of these are showing she's having anxiety about school. Mrs. Horton is defensive to the point of yelling in frustration at Mr. Stafford, so that relationship there is going to need mended, and it might even be past the point of mending. And last but not least, Mr. Stafford he became angry with Mrs. Horton due to lack of preparation for the meeting, so he's obviously frustrated as well, and it just might be in Julie's best interest to go ahead and move, because there's also going to be some bias now built up from this situation. I think also moving forward, there needs to be a plan for Mrs. Horton. Just with this situation with the Stafford family, there's been complaints also from other parents, and she's also juggling having to be a single parent of 2 teenage kids, and so yeah, there needs to just be a plan to support her, whether that's giving her some more aid support in her class, or allowing her to have more collaboration time with other first grade teachers, or even as an administrator stepping in to observe her and give her more frequent feedback. Category 4, debrief the problem by reflecting. So as I was looking through this problem and reflecting on different things, something I was thinking about as I was reflecting was I've had a similar situation to this. A parent didn't want their child in a certain class. We honored that parent's request. And there was worry there as to whether that other parents would start coming forward and requesting the same thing. Thankfully, it hasn't been brought up anymore. But I think just in general, that is something that I was able to align with, and I think Mrs. Wilson, if she can move Julie, assuming that the request is valid, and that there are things that need to be fixed within Mrs. Horton's classroom, that she honors that request, but that could be a concern moving forward too. I was feeling uneasy just because facing conflict is also never a fun thing. I cringed when I heard Mrs. Wilson didn't initially discuss with Mrs. Horton about the situation and then conference with Mr. Stafford. I think jumping straight into a meeting with all of them together was a big no-no. And then last, I think something that I value is just, I value as a future administrator my staff, and Mrs. Horton again has won an award as Teacher of the Year, and she's been successful. And so she obviously is in a phase of life where things are difficult, and I still need to value her even though this is a tough situation. Category 4, identifying unresolved issues. A few things that still need to be sought out and thought through are feelings of all the students in Mrs. Horton's class. Is Julie the only one feeling unsafe, or are there others that will start coming forward? How Mrs. Horton moves forward teaching class is a big unresolved issue. Can she handle some of this frustration that is being felt from parents and continue to do a good job at creating a safe classroom environment? And last but not least, will other parents step forward and ask to have their students moved? That's a big unresolved issue of if we take this leap and move Julie, what's this going to do for the rest of our classes? Category 5, Component 1, promoting academic success for every student. I think by moving Julie to a new room, if it's necessary, shows that there's going to be academic success for her. She's going to hopefully be in a safer environment and feel more comfortable in her learning. A plan moving forward with Mrs. Horton allows academic success for every student, and that she's receiving hopefully more feedback and improving in her teaching. And then reviewing the handbook to ensure policies are being followed is again vital to making sure as the administrator you're covering your tracks, and is again going to ensure the academic success of students. Component 2, promoting personal well-being for every student. Meeting with Julie to ensure she is heard shows that I genuinely care for her. Moving Julie, if necessary, will promote her well-being, and more frequent walkthroughs of Mrs. Horton's classroom will also show that you genuinely care for her and the students that are in that class, and allow them to succeed this school year. Category 5, Standard 3, enhancing instructional capacity. Having a plan with Mrs. Horton is going to allow her to continue to be an educator that is going to change students' lives. More frequent walkthroughs is going to equal more feedback, which will grow the instructional capacity in her classroom. And valuing Mrs. Horton as an individual lets her know that you've got her back, and even though this is a difficult situation, you're going to support her. And with that, that concludes my case study. Thanks for watching. Have a great break.